is a lot going on in those 10 short verses that we just read from Mark's gospel today. Have you ever noticed that Mark doesn't wax poetical about Jesus and his ministry? He just gets right down to it. In Mark's gospel, Jesus and the disciples are running here and there. They're doing this, and then immediately they're doing that, and then immediately they're doing something else. It kind of sounds like our overscheduled lives a bit, doesn't it? So, they've been at the synagogue today, where Jesus has been teaching and gaining attention for teaching with authority, and then he did that whole thing where he shouted at the unclean spirit and it obeyed him, and he healed the man in the synagogue. This is all from last week, but the continuation of it is today, and today we hear about what they do after that. They've been at the synagogue, right? And then they leave the synagogue, and as soon as they leave the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew. And it just happened that Simon's mother-in-law was sick with a fever. So they told Jesus about her, and Jesus did what Jesus does, and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her. And she began to serve them. I used to really take issue with the treatment of Simon's mother-in-law in this passage that we heard today from Mark's gospel. I used to take issue with it because, A, the poor woman wasn't even given a name. And so I was in my mind as I'm writing the sermon, I'm trying to give her a name, but nothing really stuck. Also, it seemed like, as the only woman in the story, her only purpose was to serve the guys who had been out doing the real ministry. But then I read this great little commentary by Caroline Lewis, a preaching professor at Luther Seminary, on Simon's mother-in-law that addressed these things, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I also remembered the day that my mother turned 60. Turning 60 in Norway is a huge deal. She grew up in Norway, and so 60 was the big one. She always talked about the big 60. And so my brother and I flew home to surprise her for her birthday. He was living in San Diego, and I was living in Phoenix. So our dad told Mom that he was returning some videos or something that was just totally fishy, but she bought it at 9 in the morning. I've got to return these videos, but she bought it. And so when he picked us up from the airport, and then when we were on our way back to the house, I called my mom on my cell phone and told her that I was on my way to work, and I just wanted to wish her a happy birthday. And then we got to the house, and I stayed on the phone with her and kind of tiptoed down the stairs and tried to get her to, be the one talking so she wouldn't hear my voice from two directions. And when we pulled it off, we got down to the bottom of the stairs and rushed my mother. I hung up the phone and we rushed my mother and said, "Happy birthday!" And the poor woman almost had a heart attack. I was like, this may not have been the best choice, right? Like maybe a little heads up would have been good. But also I wish I had it on video, but I don't. So once the shock wore off and all the hugs and the tears and everything, she just got up and started walking up the steps, and we said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Well, you must be hungry. I'm making you bacon and eggs." And we said, you don't have to do that. Like, just take a load off, hang out. It's your birthday. We're here to celebrate you. But she would have none of it. She would have none of it. And we kept protesting, but she finally said, and I remember this, she finally said, "Look, I want to do this. I'm just so happy that you're here." She said, "I need to feed you. It's who I am in my bones." She said, "It's who I am in my bones." The words that Mark uses when he writes about Simon's mother-in-law and how she served are the same words that he used for the action of the angels when Jesus was out in the wilderness among the wild beasts being tempted by Satan. That will be the gospel lesson in 2 weeks, by the way. Lent 1, stay tuned. But it's the same words, it's lost in the English translation, but it's the same words that he uses for the action of the angels. So essentially, Simon's mother-in-law was acting as an angel. She was doing God's work simply by being who she was and offering her particular gifts of hospitality and service. Jesus took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her. And in her gratitude, in her wholeness, she got back to the business of doing what was in her bones. So back to that little commentary that I read, I told you about. Caroline Lewis, a preaching professor at Luther Seminary, writes, Jesus lifted her up. What if resurrection is being raised up to be who you always were and were always meant to be? That it won't be hilltop houses or bathrooms you can play baseball in. And I've heard that this is a Nickelback song, is that right? I'm seeing nods, I'm showing my age. Or maybe my living under a rockness or something, but that it won't be that you have a bathroom you can play baseball in, but it will be the radical, emotional, incredible feeling of being you. That being raised up is not just some sort of spiritual future, but your present reality, here and now, to live as you. Your mind, spirit, body, everything together, everything that you were always meant to be. The story of Simon's mother-in-law tells us that God does not call us to be something we are not, but is in the business of restoring us to who we really are. There's magic that happens when we are restored to who we are meant to be. There's magic that happens when we are restored to who we really are and when we are brought back to our bones. I call it magic, but I suppose I should call it what it really is, and that is God working. There was a great example of this on the popular Humans of New York blog. Does anybody follow that at all? It's this blog, this man, I think his name is Travis, I should have written it down, but he goes out and takes pictures of people in New York City and asks them a thought-provoking question. And so often you don't get to hear what the question was, but you get to hear the answer. I'm guessing that he asked this man whether he had any tattoos, but here's what this man says. It's a picture of the man showing his arm, and he says, it's a tattoo, and it says 10.2.7. He says, 10 years, 2 months, 7 days. It's the only tattoo I have on my body. I was the youngest person in prison, so I withdrew into myself and I started writing in a journal every single day. It's a really great spiritual practice, by the way. I'm bad at it, but it's a great spiritual practice. That journal became my world. I used it to figure things out, and one of the first things I realized was that I'd stopped being me. It wasn't so much the crime that had landed me in prison. It was that I had decided to stop being me, and I needed to find that nerdy, intelligent kid that I'd once been. So I started studying in prison. Then one day I got a letter from Principal Lopez, and she told me, I grew up with you, and I know that you aren't the person they say you are. So the moment you get out of prison, you are going to come to speak to my kids because I want them to learn from your experience. And I immediately started crying in my cell. And sure enough, 2 days after I got out, she called me on the phone and asked, why aren't you here yet? It's magic that happens. It's God's work when we're brought back to our bones. And God is always at work, always in the business of healing, always in the business of resurrection, always lifting us up to new life, whether we can feel it or not, lifting us up to be who we were created to be. Jesus brings us back to our bones, and at the bare bones, if we haven't quite figured out what our niche is, at the bare bones, we are all fiercely and madly loved children of God, the one who created us in the first place. The love of God is in our bones. Sometimes it takes a little work or a little rest or a little surrender to feel it again, but it's there. Sometimes it takes someone telling us the story of God's love for us to recognize that it has been there the whole time. We had a leadership retreat with Pastor Deb Stalin a few weeks ago, and she told some really powerful stories about people who had heard the gospel for the very first time, about people who had heard the good news that there is nothing, absolutely nothing that they need to do to earn God's favor, that there's nothing, absolutely nothing that they can do to make God abandon them, that God is fiercely and madly in love with them as they are in that moment. When people heard this gospel news for the very first time, she told us that their responses were, I always knew God had to be like that. They had heard other things about God, but they always knew that God had to be like that God had to be love and forgiveness and acceptance. The love of God is in our bones. I always knew God had to be like that, and God is like that. We hear it in the biblical stories, in our own stories, and in the stories of people we meet. We hear it in today's story from Mark. Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law, and then the disciples go and get all the rest of the sick people in the whole town. Everyone. And I love that they say, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And I wonder whether the whole city was gathered around the door because they wanted to watch, or because the whole city was gathered around the door because all of us in some fashion stand in need of God's grace and forgiveness and love and healing and compassion. The whole city. And Jesus touched all the people who were not supposed to be touched, even with a 10-foot pole. And he brought them back to their bones, and he made them well. He cured all of them. He cast out the illness, he cast out the demons, and he cast out the shadow of doubt that they were loved and that they were valued and that they were God's children. I always knew God had to be like that. It's in our bones. In our reading today, Jesus had a pretty full day, I would say. And so what did he do when he was tapped out? He went back to his bones. He went away to a deserted place and he prayed. I imagine him on his knees, but I wonder whether he wasn't just kind of splayed out like, oh, help. He tapped back into the source. He tapped back into the source of all love and all forgiveness and all power. He connected with God. It was a big day for Jesus. You know, come to think of it, all of the days were probably big days for Jesus, right? Especially the way Mark tells the story. But it was a big day for Jesus, and today is a big day for us, isn't it? It's a big day for us as a congregation. We have our official new member reception. We get to welcome new people into this ministry. We get to learn from them. We get to learn about them. We get to be changed and grow because of them. We have our annual meeting where we'll be talking about where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and where we get to tap back into the source with prayer, with fellowship, and where we get to come back to our bones and ask the questions. How is God calling us to be uniquely who we are as Cross of Peace Lutheran Church in this place at this time? And how can we share this amazing gift of gospel with the people around us? We have lots of important stuff to discuss. We have decisions to make. And we have cake. Today is a day when we're reminded of why we're here. And we're here to remember and to remind one another of God's presence, not only in this place, but in all places. To remember and to remind one another of our identity as God's children, as stewards of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to remember and to remind one another of our call to be God's presence in the world by being who God has created us to be down to our bones, for the sake of the community and for the sake of the whole world. Thanks be to God.